Hi, Robert.
Hello, Henry.
Hi, this is Henry Farrell of George Washington University and the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm talking to Robert Farley of the Patterson School in the University of Kentucky.
Howdy, howdy.
And we're both IR professors who are really interested in the kinds of stuff that is happening at the moment in Egypt and Tunisia and other parts of the world. So what's your take on the revolution in Egypt?
Well, I was going to say Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, potentially Iran. Who really knows, right? I guess my first thought on this is to sort of sit back and wonder, in 5 years and 10 years, are we going to refer to this as the Egyptian Revolution or as an Egyptian Revolution? The military has thus far been almost remarkably conducive to the demands of the protesters, even in terms of figuring out who's going to outline the new constitutional rules and so forth. And so it certainly at this point seems like we would be saying Egyptian Revolution, but I guess that there's still some skepticism in my mind that what we are really seeing here is something that is going to earn this sort of Scotch-Polian idea of a revolution, rather than just the replacement of one political elite by another elite, and maybe not even the full replacement of a single political elite, but rather sort of the reformation of a political elite with more or less the same people at the top, with just a few names changed. And so I guess right now that's my real, I wouldn't even say it's a concern, but it's my real interest, right? Is this really going to be an Egyptian revolution? Because if it is, that's really exciting, right? It's a big country, and it's really interesting to have a revolution in a country like Egypt.
Well, it's a real question, and I think you can distinguish between two forms of that question. One is you can obviously. We're going to see a lot of disappointment. This is something that is inevitable in any political process. One of my friends, who's a big supporter of the left, was saying that his ideal bumper sticker back in 2008 was "Vote for Obama 08. Be prepared to be disappointed by somebody new." So so there's going to be inevitably a lot of disappointments and kludges and compromises. But the interesting question I think you're pointing to here is, does this actually create something which is a significantly altered constitutional system, political system going forward? And I guess the negative way that you could think about that would be to point to some of the colour revolutions that we saw a few years back, which have not, by and large, had they've led to some improvements, but nothing that you could easily characterise as being sustainable representative democracy. But then I guess if you wanted to be optimistic about it, you could point to the fact that one of the big differences here is that there isn't a big, powerful outside power like Russia, which has interests in ensuring continued connections with the old oligarchic elite at the expense of reform. The US, while it clearly has had some significant problems in adjusting to the possibility of somebody new, probably is not going to be interested in retaining those sort of old ties in quite the same way. And Saudi Arabia, which is presumably quite interested in maintaining the status quo, probably doesn't have enough significant internal influence to do that.
Right. It is. I'm glad that you point out the colored revolutions, because there was and I can't remember, but I just read it, a interview with the Ukrainian foreign minister, who of course is part of the. Oh, and I always screw them up, but I want to say it's the Yushchenko coalition. Is that the one that's in charge right now? The pro-Russian.
I think it's
effectively the pro-Russian government.
I'm not. I think it's Yanukovych at the moment. I'm not a Ukraine specialist, but that's my memory.
Right. No, that's entirely the one who didn't get poisoned,
and
the one who's pro-Russia, and you could see some distinct skepticism on his part about the Egyptian revolution, about what it would mean, and looking at what we call the color revolutions. There's not a lot. Ukraine is an interesting case. They have had a couple more or less peaceful elections, and they've had a more or less peaceful transfer of power, but because the government that is in power right now is relatively closely aligned with Russia, there's a deep level of skepticism about how democratic the country is. Whereas Georgia is sort of the opposite. In Georgia, you have what is a quasi strongman in Saakashvili. Not quite a quasi strongman, but certainly someone whose democratic credentials aren't 100%. but who's aligned with the West. But in neither case, nor certainly in Kyrgyzstan, can you say that there has been this unalloyed success in terms of replacing autocratic regimes and autocratic ways of approaching politics in these former Soviet republics.
Well, yeah.
And that doesn't really suggest that there are really tremendously bright prospects for Egypt, because if you were to say, where is democracy as we understand it in the Western sense, and the political institutions of the West, where will it most likely find fertile ground? Ukraine, Georgia, or Egypt? And I can't see myself saying Egypt ahead of the other two, although I think you make a good point that the looming shadow of Russia makes a lot of difference even for the internal arrangements in some of these countries.
Yeah, well, I guess a lot of it comes down to the question of whether or not you think whether or not internal or external circumstances dominate. Here, you could make a good argument that the internal circumstances of Egypt and of many other countries in the Arab world make it less likely that one would see change than in the former Soviet republics. But then the alternative explanation obviously might be that the external circumstances are such that you might see slightly you might have a slightly more optimistic take on this. Of course, I think the one thing that is clear. In any event is that the kinds of lies and idiotic assumptions that, for example, went into the Iraq War, where people seemed genuinely to believe that if you topple a dictator, that everybody is automatically going to embrace democracy, whiskey, sexy, all of these terms which right-wing war bloggers came out with at the time, that has completely exploded. And indeed, I guess the fact that many of these war bloggers seem to be so opposed to what has happened in Egypt over the last couple of weeks kind of exposes the lie of what they were arguing back then in any event.
Right. Well, I mean, it certainly is an interesting divide that's emerged, where it's not just bloggers, but some commentators on the right. I think it's sort of exemplified in the popular media by Glenn Beck, but also Rush and some other people have expressed a deep level of skepticism about the possibility of democracy in Egypt, right? And sort of actively saying that democracy in Egypt is a bad thing. And I don't know, did you read Matt Duss's wonderful article on Herzliya?
It's funny when
conference?
Yeah, when you said that sentence, I was thinking, how do I bring in Matt Duss's wonderful article on the Herzliya conference? Because I think this is one of the smartest and most interesting things that I've read. This is a conference that I've heard about before. It's described, I think, in Matt Duss's article as being Woodstock for neocons, and this is basically this,
which is a wonderful phrase, right? It's such a wonderful phrase.
Yeah. So basically, what you have is this conference, which is run by a group within Israel, and which tends very much towards the more hawkish line of Israeli nationalism, and where clearly there are a lot of people who went into this conference when they were organizing it, thinking that the major stress and emphasis of the conference was going to be on the Iranian threat, as it always is. The Palestinian question hardly gets a look in, but instead you have all of these people who are basically having meltdowns about Egypt and about what is happening in Egypt, and the clear implication being here that, maybe the Egyptian autocratic party were bastards, but they were our bastards, and we would much prefer to be dealing with dictators who can keep their people in line than with a democratic Arab republic who might not necessarily have the security desires that certainly that the Israeli right and maybe also the Israeli mainstream would prefer them to have.
Right. I mean, there's an interesting what you get from reading that piece, and from conversations I've had with Israelis in the past. There was always a deep skepticism about the Bush argument for, and this goes to what again is I think a genuine divide, that there are still neocons who think that the Egyptian revolution, if that's what it is actually a fantastic thing. So there is a divide. It's not just as if they've all gone against the Egyptian revolution, but
the one.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the one thing I've got to say is that the one thing that I thought was absolutely correct about the neocon analysis of things when they set themselves against realists was that the situation in the Middle East couldn't continue forever, that it was very clear that these bloated, corrupt, autocratic regimes were sort of completely illegitimate, were sort of effectively being propped up in many cases by a combination of repression at home and direct support from the US outside, and that sooner or later something had to give in this. Now, obviously, the solution that the neocons adopted of invading Iraq and thinking that the entire Middle East was then going to topple like dominoes turned out to be one of the most egregious policy mistakes of the United States in the last 20 or 30 years. But nonetheless, that one part of the analysis, the idea that the current status quo could not endure forever, I think is something which was absolutely correct, which one also sees smarter Israeli commenters, some of them have made on sort of similar points, well, along the lines of, well, yes, there are certainly things to be worried about within Egypt that might, for example, sort of not be willing to maintain the kinds of border controls against Hamas that the previous government did, but nonetheless, sooner or later, Israel is going to have to get used to a Middle East in which people actually have a voice, and that maybe trying to come to terms with that might not be a bad thing for Israel over the longer term.
Right. And there's even been sort of an undercurrent within Israeli politics and within Israeli explanations of long-term hostility between Israel and the Arabs, which sort of blames autocratic Arab regimes for essentially perpetuating the conflict in order to remain good with their own people. So the argument being that much of the hostility that the Arab people feel towards Israel is actually just sort of mocked up by these authoritarian governments. And I don't know, have you been reading Ellis Goldberg's blog?
I have.
Ellis is a professor at the University of Washington.
I've not, I'm afraid to say I've not.
He had a very interesting post, and I thought a very sort of well-constructed post, which essentially dispelled the idea that Hosni Mubarak was a friend of Israel. So arguing that you didn't see any of the warmth between Mubarak and the Israeli political class that you even saw from Sadat, and much less from sort of the Jordanian political elite. And that Mubarak was consistently willing to allow and even encourage the most vicious critiques of Israel in Egyptian politics, and while also maintaining the sort of high-level political engagement with Israel, but simply arguing that this was not in Israel's long-term interest, was maintaining a regime like this next door.
Hello?
I'm here.
Sorry, I broke up there for just a moment towards the end. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting re-examination. Of course, I'm not an expert on Israeli domestic politics, but it's very clear that Israeli domestic politics has more or less sidelined a whole bunch of questions, including, of course, the question of an Israel-Palestine peace accord, on the assumption that the status quo was something that was that was congenial in many ways to Israel. And so the interesting question then for me is, if we do see this reevaluation of Israel's interests, does this perhaps then lead to at least a greater degree of openness in principle to the realization that something has to be done in order to sort out that weeping sore?
Right. So getting on to what we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the social networking aspects a little bit later in the conversation. But I mean, people demand predictions, right? Because that's all part of the accountability. And let's not necessarily make predictions, but what are the next dominoes? What are the next steps? Are there going to be next steps in this? Where other countries actually undergo, because Egypt's a really large country, and you would expect it falling in the forest to make a big sound and maybe affect the other trees too. We know there's stuff going on in Bahrain, in Jordan, in the Palestinian Authority, in Algeria, even in Iran. And what are your thoughts about how much farther this goes?
Well, clearly, as you say, there's stuff happening. The interesting question, the hard question to answer, which I don't have the expertise to answer, is what are the consequences of it? I guess one could think about it in a number of different ways. First of all, there's clearly a learning effect that's going on among dissident populations within these regimes, so that And I think here, very clearly, Al Jazeera has played an incredibly important role in spreading the message and spreading the word, in providing, sort of almost inadvertently, a kind of a package deal of here are the kinds of things that are happening, and in sort of helping to persuade people, at least to some degree, that perhaps protests, that collective action, can have some consequences. So getting rid of that fatalism, which very often is, sort of is one of the crucial barriers that collective action faces. But the other side of this is, of course, that the regimes in question are not, they're not sort of be left lying by the wayside either. They also are able to look and to learn. And so you see, for example, the substantial payments that I believe Bahrain and a couple of other states have started making to their citizens, effectively, basically to buy them off and to buy, try to make them feel more materially comfortable, which is maybe not entirely a bad idea, because very clearly the Egypt protests, much by economic conditions and by the lack of economic growth trickling down to the lower segments of the population, as it was by political rights and all of these things. One also sees the kinds of preemptive moves that one has in Jordan, where the cabinet has effectively been sacked in order to try and preempt protests before they start. And then, of course, one gets the Iran situation, which is a different situation in that this is the one country in which we know that the security forces are prepared to act extremely brutally in order to try to put down any incipient protests. Nonetheless, there does seem to be something happening. I've seen estimates ranging from the tens of thousands in the US press to the hundreds of thousands in the Financial Times as to how many people actually turned out yesterday, but also very clearly there has been a fairly brutal reaction to that as well. So, and also I guess one final thing which I think is really important here is this is not led by the US. So one sees, a lot of people tend to look at this through a U.S. lens, through the either the Obama administration or the U.S. in general encouraging or not encouraging these things, and the U.S. can play a significant role. But this has not been generated directly or even largely indirectly by U.S. policy. This is a whole bunch of separate things which are going on, and also I think it's important to point out that it's not only countries in the United States that the United States tends to be interested in that are relevant here. So we see some unrest happening, for example, in African countries where there is precious little to no media attention simply because these countries aren't on America's radar screen.
Right, yeah. Libya as well, as I understand there are demonstrations in Libya. So it's interesting in that sense because it does sort of harken back to 1989, and being able to explain to my 20-something students, this reminds me of 1989, just gives me no end of pleasure because they were 2 years old.
It terrifies me
when 1989 happened. But there's a similar confused U.S. reaction to the whole situation, which sort of outlines that the U.S. is playing a role in this that it doesn't fully understand, and that may not be that relevant to what's actually going on. I will be interested, especially in the case of Iran, to see whether the experience of the regime in putting demonstrations down last year makes it much more effective at putting down demonstrations this year. My wager would be yes, that there's probably going to be demonstrations of an effect of some significant learning on the part of at least the Iranian regime, which is probably going to give the Islamic Republic a step up in terms of shutting down the demonstrations. That perhaps some of the other regimes, and that it seems clear that the Egyptian regime just never quite got a hold on, right? I mean, they used some of these tools of connectivity and so forth, and they sort of understood what was going on, but it was also apparent that they were always 3 or 4 steps behind the protesters. And my suspicion will be that everyone else having seen this, every other regime is going to become somewhat more competent, but the Iranian regime will be even more competent because it experienced almost the same thing last year in the Green Revolution.
Another difference, and this is something that my co-blogger Daniel Davies has pointed to, is that there may be a bastard gap here, which is to say that one of the things that reliably helps shore up unstable regimes under these circumstances is the ability of the government to call upon, to mobilize significant sectors of the population of its own. Typically in Eastern Europe, this was miners of one sort or another, who basically, so when you had people demonstrating in the cities, tons of buses of miners would be brought in from the depressed parts of the countryside, who would basically beat the shit out of the demonstrators, and that would be that. So you have a means of responding which doesn't necessarily involve the amping up of the security apparatus of the state in quite the same way. And clearly Iran has that in a way that, for example, Egypt did not. There is already an extremely well mobilized segment of the Iranian population which is pro-regime and which can be relied upon, at least to some degree, to act as a civil. There's a civic militia effectively there which can act to help beat down the demonstrators if need be, without the regime itself being seen to be quite as repressive. It makes it easier to.
Right. Right. It will also be interesting, though, and I'm sort of thinking to the philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty here, how long the Iranian regime can survive sort of coasting from contingent moment to contingent moment, right? Sort of from emergency to emergency, and whether that sort of emergency living will ever quite get to the regime and sort of create some sort of interest in stability. But I don't know. We live in interesting times, I suppose.
Certainly.
So one discussion that has received a lot of attention ever since people began calling this a Twitter revolution is the role of social networking technology in these revolts. And I mean, I know you have some thoughts, so I mean, why don't you just sort of lay out what?
Okay, well, I guess my thinking is that the first thing I would say is that there is a lot of debate, there's a lot of hot air, and we really don't know all that much about what the relationship has been between social movement, between social software of one sort or other, and revolts in the past. We only have the vaguest idea of what the relationship might be. And this is something that a bunch of colleagues of mine, myself, Mark Lynch, John Sides, and Sean O'Day, together with Ethan Zuckerman at Harvard and with John Kelly at Harvard, wrote a report for the U.S. Institute of Peace, basically saying, as is the kind of the perpetual refrain of academia, more research is needed. In other words, you have these people, including some pretty highly placed people within the State Department and elsewhere, who have these theories about what kinds of things ought to be done in order to support the internet, but we simply don't have enough real knowledge of what the likely consequences of different policy actions might be that we can really sort of lay out a very strong agenda. Hillary Clinton gave a speech at my university, GW, today. I understand that the university president gave our research a name check in introducing, so I don't know whether this is going to get any attention, but I think that's the major point that I think we would like to make, is that we simply don't know enough about what is happening. I think that there are some things that you can infer from what has happened. First of all, I think that the very strong view that, for example, Evgeny Morozov takes, which is that maybe the internet aids dictators more than it aims democracies. One of the things I think we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that view is shot through with as much nonsense and holes and contradictions as is the alternative view, which you see more often on the other side of the aisle, which is the idea that the democracy, the internet, and sliced freedom, and the American way are rolled up into one delicious package, which, when spread around the world, will result in everything that the U.S. wants to see happening. So I think that what we have seen is we don't know the extent to which social media did play an important role in this. We can say that they probably played some role. Tom Slee, I think, who's been quite skeptical on this stuff, as opposed to where which he came up with today, which more or less admits, well, I don't like to say this, but there is clearly something that's happened there. But also, I think we can say that social media doesn't work on its own. I think that really, if one has to point to something which was important here, it's how social media has worked together with, and in some ways subordinate to, more traditional forms of media, and in particular satellite broadcasting. I think the real story, the interesting story here, is the Al Jazeera story, and the way that Al Jazeera spread around, so basically spread, as I say, this sort of this template, this idea, yes, if you go out and sort of if you protest in the streets, you actually might get somewhere, and this may have helped at least spur collective action. Whether or not it has helped to make that collective action successful is an entirely different question. I think that's going to play out in a number of different ways, but I think it's pretty interesting nonetheless. And I know that you also have some thoughts on this, so maybe.
Right, right. Well, I mean, we should hardly be remiss in noting, or we would be remiss in not noting, that Al Jazeera is something that the neoconservative right has gotten completely wrong. Al Jazeera does seem to be really important to the expansion of, or the success of the uprisings in Egypt. And Al Jazeera is simply, not an anti-democratic force. As it was understood to be during the Iraq War, where there were even calls to attack Al Jazeera directly. Because it was supposed to be so anti-American, anti-freedom, anti-democracy, and so forth. And this is not to say that Al Jazeera has an institutional interest in promoting freedom, democracy, so forth and whatnot, but it obviously plays some role. It's interesting, the debate, I'm sure that a lot of our readers have been following, and these debates have been very interesting watching them, with many of the technological determinists sort of declaring triumph, and then sort of old-style activists reacting just very indignantly even to the suggestion that Twitter and Facebook have taken the role of old-style, genuine revolutionary activism. In my case, and this has been aided because I've been teaching about the revolution in military affairs over the last couple of weeks, and so these thoughts are already in my head. There was a very interesting Wall Street Journal article a couple days ago, which talked about, I believe it was either the 25th or the 28th, but anyway, it was creation of what were effectively 21 different protests in Egypt at roughly the same time, and social networking clearly played a role in the ability of the organizers to put all of these protests together. But sort of old-style activist networks and old-style activist ties and old-style revolutionary fervor also had a role in the ability. And so there was a synergy between the social networking and the more traditional modes of resistance to the state. But the impact was something that sort of theorists of the revolution in military affairs would understand very well. That in the end, what happened was that the Egyptian security services were so confused by the multiple avenues of attack that the demonstrators were using, what were effectively multiple avenues of attack, that they were unable to react in a sufficiently dexterous manner to shut down all of protests or to contain all of the protests. And so effectively, what the social networking did in this sense was give the protesters, using some of the old traditional means, the ability to confuse and to get inside the decision cycle of the Egyptian security services. And when that happened, you saw something which is very similar to what a revolution in military affairs theorist would say would happen when you do get inside the social or the decision-making network or decision-making cycle of the enemy, which is that the security services effectively collapsed on themselves. That they simply lacked the ability to push back in any kind of meaningful way, because it was just like the giant traffic jam of misunderstanding on their part and unawareness of what was going on. So the issue then, or what the social networking did, was not so much allow people to come together; it was to allow people to disrupt how the security services functioned. So in other words, protests that were so disruptive of the standard operating procedures of the security services that they simply couldn't respond. And I haven't really seen exactly that argument before. I'm just sort of running off this Wall Street Journal article, but just sort of on its face, it seems kind of plausible to me, or at least it seems interesting and worthy of some further inquiry, because there clearly is a synergy going on. It's not just Twitter, and it's not just citizens because they can tweet to one another going out into the streets, right? But on the other hand, it seems very implausible to me to argue that there is no effect from social networking on what's going on here. And so I guess the issue for scholars is to figure out what exactly this effect is. And as you pointed out, we're academics, and so we're not going to figure this out for another 150 years. But when we do, we'll have at least eight or nine theories which are equally plausible.
So yeah, well, I think that's all right. I think there's I guess one thing that immediately emerges from that for me is that real people don't reduce down to the happy little one-dimensional sort of stereotypes that we tend to talk about in policy arguments. So, of course, if you're an activist, you're going to look at this stuff, and you're going to look at social media, and you're going to look at ways in which you can use it, but you're not going to use it as your only tool, because why would you use it as your only tool? It's useful for some things. It's maybe not so useful for others. And so one of the other things I thought that was very interesting in that Wall Street Journal article was the discussion of how the organizers effectively blanketed this particular working class area of Cairo with very traditional, very mundane leaflets, trying to get people to turn out. Just the idea here being, first of all, this was in the secret protest, the one that they didn't want the police to know about. So they blanketed the area around that protest more vigorously than they did in many other areas. But secondly, very clearly, the reason they wanted to do this was to get working class people to actually come out. And one thing that one has to remember here is that the organizers of this protest, these young people, they are very, very non-representative of the Egyptian population. They're middle class, upper middle class, sort of disaffected young people who have university degrees, who can't get jobs, who have a lot of other frustrations and unhappinesses, but they're not at all typical of the sort of the everyday of everyday Egyptians. And this presents a real problem for them, because one of the lessons I think that we learned from reading the literature on this is that if you want to encourage collective action that might be costly, one thing you've got to do is you've got to persuade people that the people who are persuade people who are not involved yet, that the people who are involved look like them and are like them in some important way. So if you are a middle class person, so if you just have a bunch of students marching, then that's not going to get sort of the majority of the population out.
Right.
You want to get working class people, you want to get lower middle class people, you want to get a variety of different people out. And so very obviously these people are not on sort of consulting social networking sites. You reach them in different ways, and it turned out that this was an extraordinarily successful way of doing that. And I suspect, was one of the significant steps that led forward. But the other thing that I think is more interesting about the specific argument you lay out is that this kind of, it shows how people use this stuff creatively and strategically in ways that simply don't fit into traditional Washington debates. Because if you look at the sort of net-centric warfare idea, most of the people who are arguing for the internet being all of these wonderful things are arguing in terms of it being this open form of communication, which necessarily and inevitably conducts towards freedom in the long run. I think this is, the Jared Cohen or other people. This is basically the argument that they have been making. And most of the people who are arguing against this are saying, well, you see the ways in which dictatorships or others can misuse the internet to spread misinformation, to track down sort of dissidents, to sort of do all of this stuff to sort of spread propaganda. And what this is, this sort of basically sort of blows through that debate, because what you have here is activists who are using the internet, but using it specifically as a means of spreading disinformation. So this is something which sort of kind of goes. So it really blows up the debate in Washington in some very interesting ways, and I think it's a pretty significant change. And I also think this is something I like, that reading of the Wall Street Journal article. That's not a reading that necessarily leaps out of the reader, but I think it's one that is a very creative and very fruitful one.
Right. I mean, for academics, every revolution is just a data point anyway. So, but no, it's some fascinating. Well, I guess. Do we have any more thoughts on this before we leap to the decidedly more light part of our conversation? Or I don't know. What are your feelings?
I think I've said about as much as I'm prepared to say as a non-Egypt expert. I would say that one of the people I think is very interesting on this is my colleague Mark Lynch, who blogs at Foreign Policy and who has been, I think, sort of fending off media calls desperately the last few days because he happens to be both an expert on Egyptian politics and an expert on social media, and his major book is on Al Jazeera. So between those three, you can imagine he's been a popular guy the last several days.
Right. Well, he's been a fantastic resource. Sort of beyond being a popular guy. That's one of the things that Scholars blogging provides us is these expert resources, and not just him, but Ellis Goldberg and others provides us this expert resource that otherwise we would have limited availability to. But because Mark blogs at Foreign Policy, we always have some understanding of what's going on in these areas.
Well, I guess the next topic is zombies, and I have and in particular Dan Dresner's book on same. I have a copy which, because I'm not sort of actually in my office most of these days, I only got this copy a couple of days ago, so I haven't had a chance to read it. But you have, I believe, and you have some thoughts.
Well, actually, I similarly have not had a chance to read it, but I can still hold forth on zombies. There is, and I think I'm sure that our readers are immediately going to sort of take note of the disjuncture between this very serious topic, which is these revolutions in Egypt and then this question of zombies. But the interesting thing about Dan's book and the interesting thing about some of the other work on zombies has been to try to figure out basically how to use zombies as a trope to discuss questions of interesting policy relevance. And I think part of Dan's point, and one of the ways that this particular book got published, is that it does provide a very accessible way of approaching certain policy questions. Now, did you read? I mean, sort of the Bible, or I guess the most recent Bible, but the Bible of Zombie Studies is World War Z. And have you read that?
I've not. I've read my colleague and co-blogger Scott McLamee had a post or an article up on Inside Higher Ed last week which discussed it and has been urging me by email that I've got to read it, but I've not read it yet. I have voluminous amounts of other trash reading that I can refer to on this topic, but World War Z is not so far away.
Right. Well, I mean, what zombies allow you to do, because zombies are effectively non-strategic creatures, and so what is present in almost all zombie narratives is the state is present in some fashion, and the idea of state collapse is present in some fashion. I mean, and this is true of Romero's works, but it's also true of most other zombie-oriented, that there is always some sort of panicked state reaction. And this may provide a connection to the reaction of the Iranian or the Egyptian state to the threat of revolution in their streets. And so because there always is this state reaction, because zombies are effectively stupid, they're not like vampires, there are minimal legal questions, there are no real civil rights questions, although really I think that international relations and vampires would open up you'd write a much different kind of book about entirely different issues if you were using vampires instead of zombies. But what zombies allow you to do is to open up a space for thinking about competent state policy, for thinking about how the state acts under duress, under emergency, under situations which are completely outside of its standard operating procedures. And so you effectively have the state in extremis trying to react to really a threat, not only an existential threat, not only to the architecture of the state, but also directly to the entire body of the state's people. And so that's what makes these arguments and these discussions of zombies particularly attractive, and attractive in a way that doesn't apply to other fictional characters like Godzilla or aliens or vampires or whatever else. That zombies are relatively easy to understand and are a relatively simple, if somewhat intractable, public policy problem. And I know that Dan in particular has had a lot of success on this, and if you've been following him, he's been talking a lot about the various talks that he's given and so forth, and so there's still a novelty aspect to what he's doing, and people are saying, well, how can zombies mean anything? But there is a genuinely interesting public policy angle to zombies, which is why he wrote this book, and which is why this book is seeing a fair amount of success.
Yeah, I guess so. So basically, your argument is that zombies are non-strategic in a certain sense, so that they're so that by looking at the zombie threat or the zombie menace, you can tell a lot more about the ways that the state and people react without necessarily having to theorize the enemy in any sort of great detail. Is that more or less what the argument is?
Right.
And that vampires
Vampires would react to state policy, but zombies don't. I mean, they're sort of like the perfect microeconomic critters that react precisely to a set of parameters that we give to them, that we essentially allow them, and that makes them kind of interesting.
I'd kind of disagree here. I think if you want to sort of and I believe that there is a good piece of scholarship on this, which models zombie invasions using agent-based modeling. In effect, on sort of zombies here are very simple rules that you apply. Because if you think about strategic thought here, I think you'd be moving more in the vampire direction, because strategic actors, presumably they have perfect knowledge of the universe that they exist in. They they pursue down these sort of game trees right to the end in order to figure out what is the precisely the best response under any possible circumstance, to the ways that other actors are going to respond, and then they choose that response. So I think that I would actually say that the zombies are much more like simple rule-following entities than they are than our vampires, which are probably much more strategic as a.
Right, and so then what would you take away from that in terms of thinking about why? I mean, why don't we have a theory of international politics and vampires?
Good question. I think.
It's not as if we don't have a lot of vampire fiction right now. We clearly do, coming from lots of different angles.
Yeah, but I guess sort of part of this is, maybe this gets back to your co-blogger Charlie Carpenter, who is complaining about the way that Dan basically didn't have a feminist theory of zombies in there. That sex differences didn't come into it. And vampires, you would hardly go to them for in-depth feminist theory, but the vampires are all about sex. Zombies. Right. With the exception, I believe, of one book, Amelia Beamer's book, The Loving Dead, are not about sex. This is a thought or an idea that probably grosses people out. So I think that maybe the reason that we have not seen the vampire trope is because vampires don't vampires. When we think about them in popular culture at the moment, they've moved on from the Dracula type through the Anne Rice type of vampire, who was some sort of attractive, ambiguously heterosexual, figure, captivated people, to the teen angst vampire, which is the one which really is what motivates popular literature at the moment. But when you look at all of these, they're all about sublimated forms of sexual relations or love or whatever. They don't have much to do with politics. But when you look at zombies, as you say, the classic zombie movie is a piece of sociological commentary. So if you have, the classic zombie scene takes place in a shopping mall. So it's all about capitalism. It's all about the ways in which people act in a consumer society when the rules of civilization are taken away from them. So it's. I'm not going to say that it's political where the other one is not, but it's political in a very different way, and political in a way which much more easily maps onto the ways that international relations scholars think about it.
Right. So I mean, what you're suggesting then, that zombies are in some sense much more available to someone who is is basically a mainstream international relations scholar like Dan, but that we might in the future. I mean, potentially we could then productively see. Out of the mainstream international relations scholars productively using vampires or some other sort of trope for a different kind of approach to these questions.
Well, maybe the vampire squid of Goldman Sachs might be a good. Yeah. You could see vampires of capitalism. It's a very, very old trope. Karl Marx talks about vampires of capitalism. Somebody who's threatened to write a book about this for a while, and was perhaps the ideal and juncture point, because he is both a acclaimed writer of science fiction and fantasy, or weird fiction as he puts it. And also, I believe he has a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics, is China Miéville. And he's been threatening, I think, for the last several years to write a kind of a teratology of the monsters of capitalism. He's also a Marxist, trying to figure out why it is that these different tropes occur in these different ways at different times, given the politics and economics of the global system.
It's interesting. I wonder, did the undead ever find their way into? Have they ever found their way into sort of the socialist realist tradition in the Soviet Union? I mean, I know there was a healthy science fiction tradition in Soviet cinema and in Soviet literature. Do you know anything about an undead tradition?
Not in the literature as such. There's a wonderful, and this is a book I recommend wholeheartedly to anybody who's interested. It's a book by an English writer. It hasn't made it over to the United States yet. It's coming out in a few months. Francis Spufford is the author, and it's called Red Plenty. It's basically about the relationship between the ways in which the Soviet Union sought to catch up in providing consumer goods with the USSR. So it's a novel of economics, and it's much warmer and more interesting and more intelligent than that sounds. But he does at least have one discussion of zombie metaphors as a way of getting at sort of Marx's theory of capital, and the way that sort of capital creates these relations in which these social relations in which things that are supposed to be dead or not living, such as stock markets, come to assume a role as if they were living, and the living become half dead. And he uses this as a very ingenious way to sort of capture the ways in which a intellectual sort of in the 1950s in the Khrushchev era is thinking about the world, but whether or not this is a way that an actual Russian intellectual at that period would have thought about things, I think is open to doubt.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, it sort of extends the market is free, but the people are not, right? The market is living, but the people are not. And so,
yeah, and by and large, as far as I know, there was, as you say, a pretty interesting Soviet tradition of science fiction. Mm-hmm. But I think the fantastic stuff, I think, was seen as being more or less bourgeois or decadent. So you saw, for example, a lot of very interesting work being done by Soviet ethnologists on folk tales and so on. But typically, this was done in an extremely materialist and reductionist fashion. Right. I don't think, I don't think that there was all that much that was really actually fantastic there, as opposed to science fiction.
All right. Well, we have gotten from Egyptian protesters to Soviet zombies. I think that's plenty for one Blogging Heads.
Yeah, and Soviet zombies sounds like a great topic for a future novel. How would the USSR have responded to a zombie invasion? I think this is a pretty interesting question.
Right. All right. Well, then thank you, Blogging Heads viewers, for watching for another 45 minutes.
And thank you, Robert, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Henry.
Bye.
Bye-bye.